Welcome to this new virtual series, A Walk in the Park with Gil. My name is Gil Penalosa, in Spanish, Guillermo Peñalosa. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, and lived during my childhood across from a public park. My parents say that actually I lived in the park. Many years later, I served as Bogota's head of parks, sports and recreation. Magnificent opportunity. I led the design and construction of over 200 parks, from Simón Bolívar Park with over 100 hectares to multiple neighborhood ones, mostly in low-income areas. Now I live in Canada, and 15 years ago created 880 Cities, a non-profit organization which focuses on parks, streets, and other public spaces and their uses by people of all ages and backgrounds. I was elected chair of World Urban Parks twice and now serve as its ambassador.
Jayne, thank you very, very much for accepting to be our guest today. There is a lot of interest. We have people from over 25 countries listening and viewing your presentation. So you are someone who doesn't need a lot of introduction. Just thank you.
Thanks, Gil. I'm honored to be here and join you in what continues to be great work that you do across the world. So thank you so much for inviting me. Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. And what I'm going to do today is talk about the Minneapolis Park System, which really, truly is a legacy park system in the U.S. And I would also argue around the world. And talk about, in addition to that, equity work and how critical it is, and work that we did in Minneapolis, as well as work that I'm advancing in other parts of the country. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started with my presentation.
Okay.
So to give you some perspective for those of you who are not from the U.S. or North America, where is Minneapolis, Minnesota? U.S. is a big country. And as you can see on this map, I have a heart in the southern part of Minnesota. That is where Minneapolis is. It's in one of the most northern cities in the United States. So it's an interesting for many of you to understand how Minneapolis, such a northern city, can have such a great park system. So with that, let me share with you just some overview of the park system today. It's a system that has, while the city is less than 500,000 residents, the park system itself gets almost 30 million visits a year because it is such a critical part of the city. It has 180 parks that include almost 7,000 acres of parkland and water. Water is a critical element of the park system, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Because of the amount of water, the park system offers 920 buoys and canoe and kayak racks for people to actually access and use that water on a daily basis. Speaking of water, the city has 22 lakes in the city alone, which incorporates 12 beaches. It also has the Mississippi River and creek shed. So water is a critical element of the system. In addition to all the natural water, the park system has wading pools, splash pads, water parks, indoor pools, as well as the first natural flotation swimming pool in North America. It provides almost 8,000 recreation programs over the course of the year, and more than a quarter of those programs are free to residents. It has 49 recreation centers that are embedded in the city, almost 120 play areas, and almost 400 multipurpose sports fields across the park system. The urban tree canopy has always been a critical element of the park system in Minneapolis, with over 6,000 park and street trees that the park board is responsible. Again, another access to water are the fishing piers. And again, a fundamental piece of the park system is what's called the Grand Round system, which has 102 miles of walking and biking trails that surround the entire city and allow people to access the entire city of Minneapolis and its parks through this parkway system. Well, we're a northern climate in Minneapolis, so active recreation in the winter is really important. Minnesotans are hardy people. There's over 20 miles of groomed cross-country ski trails, sledding, tubing, and ski trails. We take 5 of our lakes and allow them for ice fishing in the winter. And then we have almost 50 ice rinks all across the city, most of which are outdoors. Winter, again, is very busy outdoors in our park system. We have winter festivals, things that people would think are crazy, like a kite festival, a sled rally where people design sleds to look like art and also that have to go down a sledding hill, fire and ice festivals. In fact, we also host the U.S. Pond Hockey Championships that brings in over 5,000 hockey players over a course of a 3-day weekend in Minneapolis. And then we take advantage of our park system all year round. We have a bike tour that closes the parkway system one day of the year, and people ride the parkway system. We have hundreds of runs and races, regattas, swim events, yoga and exercise events. And in particular, over the last 15 years, there's been a particular focus with at-risk youth and getting them engaged in the park system and getting outdoors, creating an urban explorers program, a bike program for kids for they have safe use of the trails and city streets, and a swimways program that gets kids actually outdoors and swimming. In the U.S., African Americans are at a much greater risk for drowning, so teaching kids how to swim is a really, really critical part of our work in Minneapolis. One of the things that's statistics that are really critical for Minneapolis that are representative of the park system, and that is 98% of residents in Minneapolis live within a 10-minute walk of a park. Research, as we all know, documents how critical it is to have safe and easy access to parks. So the fact that 98% of residents live within a 10-minute walk is a critical piece of their health and well-being. And nearly 83% of Minneapolis residents are active every day in Minneapolis. And more than half of city residents get at least the government recommended 30 minutes of moderate activity per day. Really important statistics for a healthy and active city. So how did we get here? Part of what you need to understand about Minneapolis is the history not only of the city, but the history of the park system. Lumber industry and the flower industry, FLUR, gold medal flower, Pillsbury flower, were core industries in the 1800s in Minneapolis. And as you can see by this, within 20 years, the population had exploded in Minneapolis, which drove the need to really preserve and protect the natural resources, the water, the landscape of Minneapolis. There was a landscape architect by the name of Horace Cleveland who had come to Minneapolis during this explosive growth period and talked about how critical it was to preserve the incredible natural resources in the Minneapolis region. As a result of that, residents understood how important it was. And in 1883, the Minnesota state legislature created legislation for the authorization of an independent park board. And in April of 1883, the voters ratified that creation of the park board. As a result, the Minneapolis Park Board was created in April 1883. It is independent from the city council. It is a separate local unit of government in Minneapolis, and it has the authority to acquire and manage parkland and levy its own taxes, which in the United States is a very, very unique structure. In fact, it is the only park system in the country that is established like that. So one of the first things they did was hire Horace Cleveland, who was the landscape architect who had been to Minneapolis many times and talk about the importance of protecting the natural features of Minneapolis. They hired him to do what at the time was called a blueprint for the park system. Today, we would call it a master plan. There were fundamental elements of that plan, one of which was acquiring land for the creation of the parkway system and parks, and today what is called the Grand Round Scenic Byway system. These are images back in the 1800s and early 1900s of the initial creation of that Grand Round system. This is actually the blueprint that Horace Cleveland created for the Minneapolis Park System. The roadway that's in maroon was his design of the parkway system. It's slightly different, but the framework of that blueprint is what was actually carried out over the next 50 years, acquiring land to actually create the system that we have today, such that The park system was built first in Minneapolis, and the city was built around the park system. There's some critical elements of the park system in Minneapolis that were foundations of Horace Cleveland's blueprint, one of which obviously was creating the Grand Round system, the 55-mile parkway system that encircles the city. Another element of that was ensuring that all of the land around all of the bodies of water in Minneapolis become parkland. So all the land around all 22 lakes, around the creeks, around the Mississippi River, to provide public access to all the water features. Today, over 97% of all the land that's adjacent to all the bodies of water in Minneapolis are parkland. The remaining 3% was the industrial core of the city, where the lumber industry and the flower industries were. The Park Board in 2010 created an international design initiative to actually develop the last piece of the Mississippi River, which is this 3%, to create parkland. And so the Park Board is in the process of finishing the acquisition of the land along that part of the Mississippi River, so that pretty soon all 100% of land adjacent to the waters will be parkland. Another critical element of Horace Cleveland's blueprint was that there's a park in every section of the city. So in addition to acquiring land along the bodies of water, the Park Board also in the early days acquired land to create parks in every section of the city. And those are the foundation pieces that created a city, Minneapolis, that was built around its park system. So following that, during the Industrial Revolution, it became very clear to Minneapolis and the Park Board that they needed to provide recreation outlets, particularly for kids who are working 6-7 days a week, 10, 12 hours a day. And so they started providing recreational amenities like these across the park system. I always cringe a little bit at the photo on the right that shows these kids climbing these huge structures, and think in today's world that would never occur because of the liability. But it provided incredible outlets for youth. As you can see, these are images from, again, the early 1900s of the recreational activity going on in our parks and in the waters that are managed and owned by the parkland. Very active part of the community was the park system. And in fact, the park system really became the center of community life. The image on the left is an image of what are called community sings that would happen all across the city, where thousands of people would come together and they would join in singing common songs that people knew in the United States. The image on the right is an image of a ski jumping facility we had at Worth Park, where we hosted the Olympic trials for ski jumping at Worth Park. At one other year, we also hosted the speed skating championships for the Olympics in the Minneapolis Park System. So really the park system was and still is today the center of community life in Minneapolis. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a building boom of creating all of the 49 recreation centers across the city. These centers have become the lifeblood and center of neighborhoods across the city of Minneapolis. So since we created this foundation of a system in the early 1900s, in the most recent past, I would argue since the 1980s, was really expanding the trail system in particular across Minneapolis. This is a map of Minneapolis. The maroon that goes around the city of Minneapolis is a Grand Round. But then what we started doing is building a trail network through and across the city that would connect you in different ways off of the Grand Rounds to other parts of the city. So today there's over almost 120 miles of on-street bikeways and over 100 miles of off-street bikeways. So people can access the city either by walking or biking in non-motorized ways and healthier ways to get around the city. That expansion, as I mentioned earlier, also includes acquisition of parkland across the industrial core along the Mississippi River. The image on the left is what the Mississippi River in Minneapolis looks like just below the urban core. And that you can see all the greenway, all the trail networks that cross the river to allow people to access the river. through a green environment. The image on the right is actually the River First Initiative, which is the last 5.5-mile stretch on both sides of the river, again, creating more green space and creating a trail network along that section of the river in Minneapolis. Because the trail network is so important in Minneapolis and so heavily used, that most of the trail network has separate pedestrian and bicycle trails that parallel each other to reduce conflict and provide safe ways for people to both bike and walk through that trail network in Minneapolis. Again, we are a northern climate in Minneapolis, so ensuring that we have access to that trail network during the winter months is critical. So the Park Board clears over 136 miles of trail networks in the winter. And over the course of a year, almost 30 million user miles travel on those trails annually. And as you can see, it happens not just in the winter, but in the summer, but year round. Another piece of the puzzle is connecting the Minneapolis Urban Trail Network, which is at the core of this map, to trail networks across the region. This is representative of over 8 counties that surround Minneapolis and creating an extensive trail network that provides between 400 and 500 miles of trails through these counties, with the Minneapolis trail system at the core of that 500-mile trail network for non-motorized transit across those counties. Recreation program has also been expanded to continue with sports, childcare, and a summer meal program. In fact, the Minneapolis Park Board is the #1 provider of meals to kids outside of the school day across the city of Minneapolis. We also provide and have expanded our work reaching with at-risk youth, providing a safety camp where our police and firefighters help kids that are just starting to go to school to provide safe measures and tools for them and train them how to safely go to school. We've also expanded programs connecting with at-risk youth through a street reach program and a night owls program that provides recreation center opportunities for teens on weekend nights only, so they have a safe place to go. We also create pop-up parks and hot zones across the city that move across the city depending on where there's greater at-risk or nefarious activity going on, so that we will pop up a park in a parking lot or on a street so that kids and families in those neighborhoods that are facing really risky activity can have a safe place to go over the course of summer months. We also have a youth mentorship program where we take at-risk kids and get them in the outdoors and provide them actually one-on-one mentorship program. And we have a Teen Teamworks program that is over 25 years old and provides kids and teens with a work experience and training opportunities over the course of summer months. And for them to see that Parks and Recreation actually can not only be a summer job, but could be a career. Now let me talk with you a little bit about the equity work that we have been doing. Again, as I mentioned and Gil referenced, really that work started in Minneapolis, and it is now expanded where we've done that work in Pittsburgh and in Louisville, Kentucky. We're in the middle of doing that right now. So in the United States, there's only 2 cities in the country who have expanded and built out a really data-based and transparent and legal process to ensure that investments across these park systems are done equitably. That work includes system-wide equitable investment action plans based on data. The first set of data is the community data, things looking at neighborhood racially concentrated areas of poverty, for example, looking at health indicators such as diabetes, depression, obesity, and then looking at park data such as the condition of every park across the system, looking at the history of capital investments in those parks, looking at the life cycle of those assets. Again, all quantifiable data points. And then finally, the third element is public priorities, asking the public to give us their priorities for investment and taking those 3 data points and building an equitable and transparent investment strategy across maintenance, rehabilitation, capital projects, and programming to ensure that the dollars that are being spent, public and private dollars, across the entire system are done in an equitable and transparent way using data. A critical piece of this is the community-driven decision-making, that the public tells us what their priorities are, and based on the conditions of the neighborhoods that are surround those parks and the condition of the parks, an investment strategy is then built across the entire system. Again, the only country, I apologize. Right now, the only cities in the country that have done this are Minneapolis and Pittsburgh. And I am in the process right now of working with the city of Louisville to develop an equitable investment strategy for them. In the US, we have systemic racist issues, not only in a variety of places, but also in parks. And one example of that, I'll give you a few statistics that I think are very telling. One, the Trust for Public Land in 2020 did a study looking at 108 cities across the US. They found that in 94% of those cities, that parks that were in neighborhoods that served predominantly communities of color, as compared to those parks that were served predominantly white residents, that the parks in communities of color were half the size of parks in communities that served predominantly white residents. Also, that study found that parks that serve predominantly low-income residents as compared to parks that serve predominantly wealthier residents were 4 to 5 times more crowded and half the size of parks in wealthier neighborhoods. So the issue of equity transcends parks and park access and park use and park spending. So doing equitable investment strategies is a critical element of addressing systemic racism issues here in the United States. So with that, Gil, I'm happy to answer any questions that you or others have about both Minneapolis as well as the equity work that I've been doing across the United States.
Thank you, Jayne. Excellent. Very, very fascinating presentation with so much really, really good information. And one of the things I also want to mention, we have people from all over the world now. We have people now from Chile, from Brazil, from South Africa, Sweden, Spain, as well as cities all across Canada, the US, and many other countries. And I'm here more as a facilitator. I just want to highlight a couple of things that Jayne said, because she said so many important things. One is that 98% of the citizens in Minneapolis have a park within walking distance. Why is this important? Because everybody should have a park within walking distance. And in the US, the wealthiest country in the world, over 100 million people who live in cities, that's 1 out of 3 people do not have a park within walking distance. Do not have a park within walking distance. That's why Waterfront Parks has a program and a call to action, 10, 20, 30. Everybody should have a park within a 10-minute walk by 2030, because it's totally unthinkable. Also, because this is also an issue of equity, because most of the areas that do not have a park within walking distance are low-income areas. So it's not only a problem of parks, but a problem of parks equity. Also, something else that Jayne showed were the trails. The trails, it's 136 miles are plowed every winter. That's about 220 kilometers. So that people can walk and run and bike on the trails 365 days of the year. Thanks, Jayne, and thanks everybody for connecting today. Have a wonderful day. Let's hope that lots and lots of good, positive, bold initiatives come out of COP26, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil.